Good morning. How are we all doing today? Doing okay? Show of hands really quick. Who's going to a bunch of events this week for Climate Week? Cool. About most of y'all. Okay. Well, I hope you're getting enough rest during what's most likely going to be. Someone's like, no. I hope you're getting enough rest for what's probably going to be a really hectic week for most of us. I definitely am taking as many moments as I can to breathe before each one of those events. So I invite you to, let's all just take a moment to close our eyes, take a deep breath, center ourselves a little bit. It's a crazy week, it's a crazy world, but in this space we're all friends and we can all be here together. One more. Okay, cool. I think I needed that more than everyone in here. But welcome. I am going to pass the microphone off to Amy, who's one of our co-founders, and will be beginning our welcoming remarks. So everyone give a round of applause to one of Broadway Climate Summit's co-founders, Amy.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the inaugural Broadway Climate Summit. We're really excited that you're here with us today. This summit exists to bring together theater professionals and climate advocates to reimagine an industry that prioritizes climate-infused storytelling, sustainable production, and theater as a cultural movement for our planet. We want to do a special thank you to our steering committee, especially Sandra Goldmark, Edward T. Morris, Molly Braverman, and Chantal Bilodeau, who have been invaluable in guiding us in setting up this inaugural event. And we know that the human-made climate crisis is a symptom of much deeper-rooted problems. It's not just about the carbon, it's about the culture that we're steeped in. One of domination, exploitation, and extraction. And we need a cultural shift desperately towards caring, towards dignity of each other, and towards knowing that we are intrinsically part of the living earth and not separate from it. Yes, woo! And as theater makers, we know that theater has an important role to play in shifting culture. With the climate crisis escalating, we urgently need stories that help us navigate how to respond to these times. And now I'll welcome up another founding member, Nate Smith.
Hello. It's so nice to see everyone. Hello to our live streamers who are coming in from maybe all over the globe. As Amy was just saying, theater has a very important role in our species. As you all know, it's one of the most ancient parts of human existence and has always played a role in responding to what's going on, reflecting what is going on around us. There are so many examples throughout history of poets and playwrights and musicians being jailed for their work because what they're doing is powerful enough to shake up the institutions around them. And I don't need to educate anyone in this room about the moment that we are currently in that regard. So we are so appreciative. I know that everybody in this room is already doing tremendous work to help in this regard, and we just wanted to honor each and every one of you and everyone that has already been doing this work for decades and centuries in the tradition of our art form, responding to what is going on in the world around us. We are always on a razor's edge with theater funding and audiences and things like that, and the 5% left that we had of the NEA is now also being stripped, so a conference like this could not mean more than it does right now. I'm now kicking it over to Andre, who will be introducing the very first panel, but thank you again for being at this inaugural Broadway Climate Summit.
Thank you, everybody. I didn't introduce myself earlier. My name's Andre. I am also one of the co-founders of Broadway Climate Summit. And just a little bits of pieces before we go into our land acknowledgement. I want to talk on a few points of why we're doing this event, what we want to be doing moving forward, and what is the mission of Broadway Climate Summit. So on one part, this room is already filled, and there will be more coming of incredible people in theater that are already working at this intersection of environmentalism, sustainability, nature-based solutions, mission work, along with the arts. So we want to make sure that we're a platform that is supporting those groups that have already been doing the work. We're not trying to claim that this is a new thing and that we're starting it. We are primarily a vessel to support community and to build it and to build coalition and communication between all of us. And with that, we also want to be a bridge for some of the programs that already exist out there. We want to be able to engage with audiences, activate them to work with theater groups, with frontline communities, with nonprofit organizations around climate, and get people to be engaged, enthusiastic, and hopeful, very importantly, hopeful about all of this work, and also to expand the possibilities and be as inclusive as possible with people from all kinds of diversities, backgrounds, economic statuses. This is a space for everyone's voice to be heard. This is a space for everyone to share their knowledge from wherever they come from. Now, like I mentioned before, this is our first ever event. So you are here at a very, very important moment for us as a team, because this is the first time we're gathering you all here together. And we are also aware that this is an opportunity for us to show you the things that we care about, the things that we want to highlight. We like to think of this launch event as the equivalent of our first reading, and hopefully we'll get picked up after this. You know, there might be some producers in the room. And although the name is Broadway Climate Summit, it is not just the institution of Broadway. We want to be inclusive of off-Broadway, off-Broadway, regional theaters, nonprofit, indies. Everyone needs to work together in this movement. Everyone needs to collaborate with each other to find solutions. So yeah, thank you so much for being here. And I would like to welcome Opalanietet to start our land acknowledgement.
Opalanietet, also known as Ryan Victor Pierce, is a member of the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape tribal nation of New Jersey. He is an actor, singer, writer, and founder of Eagle Project, the only Lenape-led performing arts company on the traditional lands of Lenapehoking, which includes New York City. Their mission is to explore the American identity through the performing arts and the lens of our Native American experience. We are honored to have Opalanietet lead us in acknowledging this land we are gathering on today.
Kwamgamel Muhemo, or greetings. The island we are currently standing on, or sitting on, and the island that this summit is being held on, as well as the island that Broadway, the theater district, and the road itself is on, is part of a larger nation, Lenapehoking, home to many nations of the Lenape. They are one of the nations of first contact with Europeans and one of the oldest continuous democracies on earth. This land belongs to the Creator. Yet it was given to the Lenape to be stewards of. It was and continues to be their land to look after, as the many nations of the Lenape are still here. And while the Lenape have always welcomed people from all over the world to their shores, that invitation comes with a responsibility, and that is to treat everyone and everything on this land with respect. Wanishi, thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, Opalanietet. I would like to get us started by introducing the first panel and our moderator. So our first panel is Creating Climate Theater from Black Box to Broadway, and I'd like to welcome to the stage Davis McCallum.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Davis McCallum. I have the honor and the privilege of being the moderator for the first panel of the summit. I want to thank all the organizers for being here and all the work that they've done, and thank you for being in this room and you who are joining us on the live stream at home. If I could please invite to the stage the members of this distinguished first panel. Please come out. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves. The topic of our panel is climate storytelling. So we hope to offer a kind of broad introduction, a kind of overview to this topic. I want to first introduce myself, and then I'm going to ask my distinguished colleagues here to introduce themselves. Davis McCallum, I'm the artistic director at Hudson Valley Shakespeare. We're a 38-year-old repertory company in Garrison, New York, about an hour north of Grand Central Station. And we have recently converted what used to be a golf course into an eco-campus. And we are building the nation's first purpose-built LEED Platinum Theater, which will be opening next summer, the Samuel H. Scripps Theater Center. Thank you. I've had the privilege of Zooming with these people over the last week in preparation for this panel. They're such a thrilling group of theater makers. I'm going to pass the mic. Actually, they have some mics, and ask them to take just a couple of minutes to introduce you to themselves, their background, and their artistry, and then we'll start the conversation from there. Thank you.
Great. Hi, I'm Amy Berryman. I'm a playwright. Who thinks a lot about climate, environmentalism, technology. All these things are sort of central questions in my work. I am one of the people on this panel, and I might be the one that is most, although we'll find out, sitting by myself and writing and like thinking of these questions I have in my brain and trying to find a way through them alone until I get to, meet a community of folks to bring a play to life, which last fall, my play Walden, which is set in a near future where climate change has ravaged our planet to the point where a lot of the government and scientists are thinking we should colonize the moon and potentially Mars, but there's this populist uprising on Earth against that to just take back to the Earth, and it's just about 3 people in a cabin, 2 twin sisters who are in that world of NASA, and a man who's a part of this climate movement. But it's set against this big sci-fi climate fiction background. So that play went up at Second Stage off Broadway, directed by Whitney White. Really amazing, beautiful production and experience, and was also in London on the West End in 2021. And that might be the piece I reference most as we're talking. But I'll also talk about how these questions I have about climate and the way that our society approaches them, it sort of infuses a lot of my work, even when it's not so overtly about that. So that's a little about me. I'll go ahead and pass the mic. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. Hi, everybody. My name is Robert Duffley. I am the founding dramaturg for LubDub Theater Company, which is a small but mighty devised theater company based here in New York. And we tell stories of science, magic, and myth with a particular focus on climate emergency and earthly repair. And in my work as a dramaturg and editor, both with LubDub and on other projects, I think a lot about the ways that we can create alternative models of commissioning, creating, and producing climate work specifically through a lens of collectivity, reciprocity, and adaptability, which I think are some particular lessons that our culture and industry can continue to draw from the climate crisis and the movements to meet it.
Hi, I'm Jane Joyner. I'm the founder and CEO of Good Energy, which is a narrative change nonprofit and story consultancy that supports creators, primarily scripted TV, film, some podcasts. We haven't done theater yet, but I'm honored to be here amongst y'all. It's one of my favorite art forms and forms of storytelling. But we really focus on how do we tell stories about the world that we live in ways that are authentic to our stories. We very much are supporters of creators and really prioritize, kind of the integrity of the story. But we also really believe that if you are telling stories about the world that we live in today or in the future or in the recent past, that climate is an authentic part of that story because it's a part of all of our stories, billions of climate stories out there at this point. My background is in climate communications. Prior to that, I've been working in this space 20 years, working in TV and film about 10 years now. I think I'll stop there. Yes, you can go that way.
Kwam Gamel Mohemo again. I'm Opalanietet, member of the Nanakoke Lenni Lenape Tribal Nation of New Jersey, and I'm also the founder and artistic director of Eagle Project, the only Lenape-led performing arts company on the traditional lands of Lenapehoking, which includes New York City. And our mission is to explore the American identity through the performing arts and our Native American heritage so that we as Americans have a more accurate recollection of our past, a better understanding of our present, for a just and more inclusive vision for our future. And we've been around since 2012. I'm also a independent theater practitioner as well, and a PhD candidate at the CUNY Graduate Center in New York City. Thank you.
Fantastic. So my first question is going to be for Anna Jane, which is to try and venture a definition of what we mean when we say climate storytelling. Can you, based on your experience at Good Energy, what do you think we're talking about when we talk about climate storytelling, and what kind of forms have you seen that take across the different media that you work in?
Yeah, so we really think about approaching climate and any kind of story through a lens. Really, it's just asking the question, if my characters were real people out in the world, how would they authentically be experiencing climate? And that can happen across a spectrum. You know, it can be just in the background, maybe not even in dialogue, showing impacts. Parasite is actually one of my favorite examples of that. You see climate impacts in the background, this horrible flood that, kind of inconveniences the wealthier family and destroys the home of the poorer family. But you can also see solutions in the background too. Even something as simple as composting in a kitchen scene, or solar panels on the shot of a house. It can come up and really just in passing dialogue, just in a quick conversation and pretty much any kind of story. That actually is really important. We're big believers in Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, who's an amazing climate scientist and one of our advisors and a close friend. She has a TED Talk called "The Most Important Thing We Can Do About Climate Change is Talk About It," because it is a predecessor to any form of action. So it just coming up in passing conversation is also really important. And then, of course, it can show up in actual storylines, everything from B storylines, where it's just a part of the story, but not the focus of the story, and then also stories where it is the central focus, like Walden. Those are kind of how we think about it across the spectrum. But I would say, a climate story is just a great story about the world that we live in. That's the kind of heart of it.
I wonder if any of the other three panelists want to kind of bounce off that. I'm wondering particularly about the structure of stories, because Anna Jane's suggesting, it can be central or it can be peripheral. But I also wonder whether kind of linear idea of storytelling, that climate storytelling invites us to expand and think more broadly about beginning, middle, and end, and these kind of deeply rooted, dare I say, Western ideas of how stories unfold. Thoughts from the group?
Yeah, well, I mean, I always look at climate theater. I mean, basically, there's two things. I mean, first is the idea that climate may be the backdrop in terms of how it influences us and our relationships and our activities. But then there's the other side of it, where our environment takes center stage, and we take second. We kind of play second fiddle to it. So our non-human kin, what are their stories? And that includes any organism that we typically call an animal or a plant or a tree, right? Some trees are hundreds of years old. They have a story to tell, right? How can we begin to speak their language, right, and learn from them? And I think also Eco Project, that's something that we've been doing and starting to do more of, is to try to tell stories where our non-human kin that we share this planet with. And they're vital to our livelihood as well, right? Just take the bee, for example, right? And we wouldn't be able to survive without the bee. So what's their story? So just using that as an example. So I look at those two aspects as to where to go and to help us understand the climate and our role within it.
Just to bounce off that, I've gained a lot of creative energy in recent years by thinking about the degree to which landscape and other species have been actively excluded from theatrical spaces and narratives. I'm sure I'm not the only one in the room to say that I really have like a love-hate relationship with the black box as a space, because in some ways it's a space full of infinite potential, and in other ways I think it's a space of like infinite exclusion, and it's a space that has historically privileged human narratives and human action over everything else. So I'm so excited to hear from folks on the panel about the ways that we can like literally tune in. I'm really inspired by the author Amitav Ghosh, who has a book called The Nutmeg's Curse, where he talks about like seeking and learning from traditions of animism where we have not excluded and muted the voices of our more than human kin.
This just makes me wish I had a notebook and was taking notes, because it just brings up so much for me as a playwright, and thinking about just the possibilities of the theatricality of that, of including our non-human kin in their stories on stage, and that this is an art form that can hold that, and that asks for it and begs for it, and that I think we as audience members and practitioners of theater are always looking for in our stories, and that just very exciting. Anyway, they're awesome.
Can I ask from the group, what are some examples of taking non-human kin or landscape and putting them in the centrality of theater making from your work in the different disciplines that you work in?
Well, a couple things. I would say end of August, we participated in the Down to Earth Festival, which is sponsored by the Martin East Eagle Theater Center. So Weed Eagle Project opened that up with a telling of a Lenape creation story that was done in Wood Hill Park. So basically our hero was the muskrat, right? And other characters were the loon and the beaver and the infamous rock of where the supposed sale took place. Also was a character in it and spoke and kind of started to lead us on this story. Now, of course, we had human actors that played these non-human kin, but nonetheless, these non-human kin were, it was their story, and we're helping to tell their story. And we also used, being outside, again, we used the trees, we used the cliffs, we used the rocks as all part of our part of our set. I would say another example in a theater was, 9 years ago, we did a play called Lost Voices, which actually was a combination of two one-act plays. And our set designer, Edward Morris, I remember had a tree that was on one side. And while this tree didn't have any lines per se, it told the whole story, the way he designed it, where you saw the tree, a healthy tree in one way, and then the climate's effect on the tree on another way, and then as the water rose, its effect on another level. So we saw while we saw one story being acted out by human actors on stage, this tree on the other end was telling its own story.
LubDub just celebrated the publication of a play called To Tell a Story About the Earth, which was written by our founding playwright, Miranda Rose Hall. And we like to think about that play as like devising with bumper rails, like in bowling. We've always been obsessed as a company with the idea of like a Mad Lib. And so that piece is actually formatted like a Mad Lib, and it includes instructions for every single company that presents or produces that work to devise a 10-minute play within a play about a local spot or species. And we have tips for ways to engage with local advocacy organizations, wisdom keepers, scientists, to do that kind of research, which as a dramaturg I love, and then to make a piece about that. So that's a piece that just was published by Concord Theatricals, and it has a frame, but the content of that frame in many ways will be different and responsive to the different landscapes and events where it's produced.
It occurs to me, that people here in the room listening to this conversation might be inspired to kind of carry forward climate storytelling in their own work, and it seems like two things that often are obstacles to that are, one, the feeling of like, I don't have the expertise to speak to that topic, and second, the kind of trap of the doom narratives around climate, and in each of your works, you've advanced a kind of hopefulness and a kind of energetic engagement with the topic of the climate emergency, and I wonder whether you could speak to how you kind of get to the starting block as climate storytellers and avoid some of those things that might foreclose other people from taking that leap.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. Yes, I think I can definitely speak to that because I think when I started writing, Walden is the second play I've written in my career, and it really came from a place of questioning of my own climate anxiety, and I didn't know much except I thought, what are we going to do when it's too late? And so started to imagine what would that look like, and really started from this place of, are we gonna have to leave the planet? Will that become the sort of liberal, minded thought? And what would happen? Will there be a certain point that climate deniers will suddenly come on board, and will it be too late then? And as I started to write this piece with these two different factions in this near future, the more I researched, the more I was like, oh, no, I'm definitely an Earth advocate. I'm definitely on this other side of this group that I'd sort of been creating from a different place and point of view. And it sort of created a much more complex political world, excuse me, in this future. And so I guess my advice would be ask the questions and dive in and learn as you go, because I think it was such a great jumping off point for me in my own climate activism, my own sort of learning. So yeah, I have another play that's questioning this movement where people are trying to extend their life and not die, where I'm imagining a future where there has been a treatment that's been developed that will end human aging. And what will that do? What does that do to a world where we have limited resources? And what's the movement against that? And so that is an example of a story that is not about climate, but it has these questions of over-consumerism and capitalism at its root. So yeah, I guess my answer would be start with these questions. No question is too stupid. No question is, I think questions are so important as a jumping off point for this kind of work, and you can learn as you go. I think it's a great place to begin. Yeah.
And I would say too that feeling of not knowing, that feeling of not having the required expertise, just expressing that is significant historically, because I think what you're feeling in that moment is what the philosopher Max Weber would call disenchantment, right? That is a form of alienation that I think is important to articulate, both in the present and from a historical perspective, looking back on this moment, asking what were people feeling.
I would totally agree. I think we've kind of done a disservice in thinking of this as a scientific issue or even just an environmental issue. You know, this is really interconnected to everything we care about, to justice, to mental health. It's a huge mental health issue, which is something that stories are really, really good at helping us process. The grief, you know, the re-enchantment of connection to this earth and remembering what a gift this is. And I think that you don't have to be an expert. You are an expert in storytelling. You are an expert in the things that you're an expert in, and this doesn't belong to any kind of subject matter expertise. This belongs to all of us. So I think enter it where you feel called. You know, enter it at the story that you're most curious about or passionate about, and there's lots of great expertise out there. We have a playbook for screenwriting in the age of climate change, but that it really is applicable to all kinds of storytelling. But yeah, I think remember that you're an expert on your stories. And then as far as the kinds of narratives, I think, you know, we really believe that we need just a much larger menu of stories, at least in TV and film, and I imagine there might be truth in this with theater. The primary kind of themes and narratives we see are a lot of apocalypse, and I have some theories about that just because that is a story that is ancient. So of course, as storytellers, when we're facing existential crisis, we go to apocalypse stories, but apocalypse just means a revealing, a revelation. And so I think asking that question of like, what is this revealing? What is the story within it? And then also a lot of eco-terrorists and a lot of shaming people about their plastic straws and SUVs. So, so I think broadening beyond that, but also like I do think sometimes we're too down on apocalypse stories because I think that like I live on the Gulf Coast of Alabama. I have been through apocalypses. There are people who have already lost, you know, their homes, their lives, and so I think we do need to be telling those stories. But we also need to be telling the courage stories, you know, like how do humans have always figured out a way to survive, and art and storytelling has been a big part of that. I like to think of Lord of the Rings, which was a foundational story in my life, and, you know, at no point of that story did Frodo think he was going to win. He did it because the stakes were too high not to try, and those are the stories that give me courage.
Yeah, I often think that, you know, in that apocalyptic scenario where we have to leave the earth and we go someplace else, what's to say that we're not going to take the same kind of toxic behavior to somewhere else and destroy that, and then constantly keep going from one place to another place, right? I mean, that's kind of the idea of the Anthropocene, right? Is that what's happening in the climate today is directly because of our involvement, which is why I like to say the man-made climate crisis as opposed to just climate crisis, because it puts the responsibility on us and not on Mother Nature, right? And yeah, I do think it's important to think of how you know, to avoid or not, we shouldn't avoid, but build, you know, look beyond necessarily the apocalypse, but to see how healing the environment actually brings us together, right? Being stewards of our environment brings us together. You know, if ruining it is tearing us apart, which I think we all would say it is, right? Because it's also part of a political crisis and you know, not just a climate crisis. How can it bring us together? And we are having a short play that I wrote, which is being read this evening here, called Tulip Tree Canoe and Oysters Too. And that's about how being stewards of the environment and trying to help maintain and protect what we call the Jersey shoreline, or that part of shoreline of Labehoking, brings these two young people from different worlds together. So that's one attempt of trying to do that, and I encourage everyone else to think otherwise. How, or in addition to, how can being stewards of our environment bring you closer to your neighbor, bring it closer to your community, et cetera.
I want to take up that prompt, Opalanietet, which is also what Amy said at the very beginning of the conference as a frame, storytelling as an agent for culture shift. And we've talked a lot about what climate storytelling means from the artist side of things, but I wonder if you might want to speak to how this work that you've put out in the world has been received by audiences, and what's the reaction been, and how has it functioned as a kind of conversation starter for culture shift?
Me. I feel like I'm talking too much, and I'd be so curious to hear y'all's thoughts on this too. I mean, I think that is the great work, right? We are so disconnected from this earth, and that's really dangerous, not just for all of us in the sense of climate crisis, but I really think it's creating a spiritual crisis and a mental health crisis. So I think the ways that we tell stories to help heal, and build that reconnection and shifting the culture in that way is really important. And then, I do think, obviously we are kind of in a crisis in this country and around the world, and telling stories that normalize conversations about the climate crisis, that help us find courage and process grief. It really is creating an immunity, to whatever is happening in the world around us, because you can't roll back the stories, you can roll back, policy and lots of other things, but you can't change the narratives that we're living under. And so the more that we shift the narratives, the more immunity we have to these other crises in our societies.
And maybe to add to that, I have a sticky pinned on my computer that has a quote from the amazing artist Taylor Mack, and it says, "People just want to go to a party." And I think, especially touching on that idea that we were talking about earlier of like people feeling like they don't necessarily know what to do, I think as theater makers, we have this tremendous platform to be inviting people to do things. Like hospitality is such an important guiding value for my company and for me as an artist, because I think there are so many people out there who, when they receive an invitation through a theatrical frame to participate in some way, that generates a lot of enthusiasm and involvement. So maybe one concrete example of that is I serve as the dramaturg for a project called We Hear You, a Climate Archive, which is a collaboration between institutes at Georgetown University, the Royal Dramatic Theatre of Sweden, and the Swedish Embassy in the US. And we commissioned 77 youth climate storytellers. We commissioned them formally as artists, not by political identification, but from biomes, so from the specific Earth systems that influence and include the climate. So like, that's just an example of like, we were able to create a frame as theater artists and then invite people into that. And by treating them as artists, we were able to, I hope, help them feel like they had something to do and a way to be heard on a different channel or a bigger platform.
I also like what you're leading us to. By the way, I also have a Taylor Mack quote on my computer, and it says, "What's gonna happen?" Which I think is kind of the key question of all theater making, anytime, anywhere. But you also mentioned the structure and the process by which you bring this work into the world, and I wonder, maybe this is a hopeful note as we get to opening up the floor to questions from the audience, but when your work, it always occurs to me that a really good rehearsal room is a model of what we want to bring out into the world, where everyone's ideas are heard, and we move with care with each other, and there's this acute sense of listening and generosity and courage. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the idea of a commitment to climate storytelling has affected your work as collaborators, the structures that you use to bring this work into the world. What about the how, not just the what? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say in terms of the structure, I think about the concept of time, right? And the concept of, I think, ecological time is very different than how we view time in our everyday lives and in capitalism, colonialism, et cetera. I think of the very first full production that we ever did was Woodbones by the late Assiniboine playwright William S. Yellowrobe Jr. And the leading character is the land. The land's a character. Now it's played by a human actor, non-gender specific, can be male, female, non-gender binary, anything. But the land is a central character, and so we travel with, and there's a timeless aspect to this land. Like there's really no, it's kind of ageless, and it's actually the human characters that are caught in this never-ending cycle The time is cyclical. It's not linear, past, present, future. The humans are repeating the same action over and over and over, and it's the land that is remaining constant, and through the concept of the story, becomes free. So I think, continuing to experiment with the concept of time and our place in it, I think is both inspirational and I think challenge for us theater makers. And just to build off the last question about audience response, it's been interesting over the years. I remember when we did Lost Voices almost a decade ago, it kind of got mixed reviews. I think a lot of people that came to the show, I think really were moved and enjoyed it. And I think some reviewers did. Some reviewers, maybe a little bit more mixed. But it was tough to get an audience there. I think it was still. Everyone was worried about the first election of Trump at that time, but not realizing that how we treat the climate was also a part of that. Now, fast forward almost a decade later, I think people are realizing that. And so when we did the Lenape creation story, and it was immersive, where we got people to swim like a loon and swim like a beaver and swim like a muskrat, as well as swim like a human, right? Explore all these different ways that all these other air-breathing mammals like us live and survive in the water. I think there was a lot of positive reaction to that and a lot of excitement over it. So I think I think people's attitudes are changing.
I've been lucky to work with several different directors on Walden in particular, and I feel like each time that director who's sort of heading they're sort of the group leader, right, bringing something different to each experience. Like in London, like our set was all from recycled materials. Like there were just sort of all these different decisions made because this was a play that is about interacting with the environment. And its U.S. premiere was at TheaterWorks Hartford, directed by Mayan Teo, who is amazing. And their vision for it was out on a piece of land. We built a cabin out on a piece of land, and the audience had to walk like 100 feet to get to this land from the parking lot and sit out and watch the play with headphones, so the actors, it felt very intimate. And the audience got to sit out under the stars and witness the sunset and the lights shift into night over the course of the play. And I think it really allowed for sort of a different type of experience, both for the audience and the actors and everyone involved. So I think it sort of has brought about different ways of working. But I'm really interested in your company's way of working that I want you to talk about.
We've made a real credo out of, I think it came to us from the director, Shana Gazansky, but the idea that what happens in the play happens in the room. So specifically if folks are interested in thinking about like, well, how do I turn this specific thing that's happening in my landscape into a piece? I would say invite that event or those ideas into your room and then watch what happens. And often what happens in the room can become the story itself. LubDub has a piece, again, written by our founding playwright, Miranda Rose Hall, called A Play for the Living in a Time of Extinction. And the way that that piece, which just finished a tour of the EU and the UK, the way that that came about is we, as a company, had been reading The Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Kolbert and feeling very intense anxiety around that, climate anxiety, right? And as we were kind of throwing paint on the wall in terms of thinking about like how are we going to wrestle with these ideas and make theater out of them, my mother actually passed away. And that piece suddenly became a story of a theater company who is trying to make a piece about climate anxiety, and then this tragedy happens, and then they have to kind of ask themselves, what is the difference between grief for a human and grief for a landscape? And those overlap in some ways and they differ in other ways. But what happens in the play happens in the room, no matter what you're working on, but especially with climate, that can be like a way in.
I love that. I want to pivot at this point to the folks who are here in the room and invite you to engage with this distinguished panel on any questions you might have about anything that's come up in the conversation so far. As any good moderator does, I have some additional questions that I'm burning to ask, so if you don't, I will. But if you do have a question, please feel free to raise your hand and ask this group. I'm eager to hear what's on your mind. Yes.
I always have a question.
Good.
I guess this is for Robert or maybe for others. You mentioned questioning the industries that we work in, how the commissions work. I work in Hollywood managing, had the great privilege of working with Good Energy for many years. Hollywood is a beast that seems like it can't change, and we are always pushing at the corners, and what narrative change means to us is changing the industry itself. But, you know, you also mentioned that wonderful sounding book that's Mad Libs for writing about ecosystems. If there were Mad Libs for changing this gatekeeper systems that we have to work within, and a regenerative lens or climate lens that we can put to our systems, our industry, what would that look like? Not to put you on the spot like that.
I'm going to repeat the question for people at home. If there were Mad Libs for the current gatekeeping system and how to get more regenerative stories happening, what might that look like? It's a question for Robert because he's worked in the form of Mad Libs before, but I'm curious to hear other people's point of view on that as well.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think my Mad Lib would be like, my industry is structured like blank, and the clue for the blank is like the structure of an Earth system. So like the project I mentioned, We Hear You, a Climate Archive, was explicitly inspired by the structure of fungi. So like those 77 stories were published and are available online now, and they're also being committed to a long-term archive in Stockholm. But that kind of network of exchange was the process, like that network of trading contacts and experiences and ideas. And then out of that kind of mycelial network, various mushrooms pop up, right? So there was a performance adapted from the stories in Sweden. There was one at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. Like, they pop up everywhere. And like, you know, I've been asking, like, what does it look like to have a commissioning model that is patterned after a river system or after a mountain system, right? Like, thinking about Earth systems as structures for artistic activity, both on an individual and an institutional level, I think can be incredibly productive, not to fetishize production.
Yes, another question here.
Yeah, I have a question about the concept of people love going to a party. And as theater makers, how do you lean into that? Because creating narratives about climate can often be a bummer, and people don't want to be lectured to, and they want to escape. So do you have any thoughts about that?
The question references Taylor Mack's quote, people just want to go to a party, and how do we avoid the trap of climate storytelling, which can sometimes be a bummer, and that people want to be engaged and sometimes want to escape the feeling of the climate emergency that we're all living in. Who's got a thought to that question?
But I'd be curious about y'all as writers. I mean, I think that is on us as storytellers, right? In the same way that we would write any story, or in my case, support storytellers. You know, I really truly despise this metaphor that comes up all the time, that's we just have to sneak the broccoli and the brownies. Because first of all, the immediate association is gross. Like, I do not want those brownies, you know? Like, we're just making great brownies about the world that we live in. And, you know, that definitely doesn't and shouldn't feel like a lecture, because then we're not engaging with the audience. And, you know, some of my favorite, I mean, some of the best TV and film of recent years, you know, has included climate change. Everything from Abbott's Elementary, which comes up all the time, Hacks, you know, a bunch of Handmaid's Tale, like all, you know, those are all TV, but they're, you know, I think Walden being a great one, you know, like Hadestown, one of the most popular Broadway shows right now, has climate themes. I just saw a great one called Weather Girl last night that it just absolutely blew my mind, from the producers of Fleabag and Baby Reindeer, where it went there, you know. It was really wrestled with this, but it did it in the most riveting way, you know. All the emotions, dying, laughing, like borderline sobbing. And so I think that there's just so many ways we can tell these stories. It's just telling stories about the world we live in, you know.
I guess it also depends on like your definition of a party. Like for me, I do, love an experience that does take me all those places where I'm laughing really hard and I'm crying really hard and I'm so in it. And it feels like a psychedelic trip almost, that I sit in a seat and then I'm transported somewhere else and I am taken away from my everyday life, but I'm also hit with so many different feelings. And to me, that is a party. Now, that might not be everybody's party, but that is why I do feel like the more we can have diverse kinds of stories, diverse ways of going about it, diverse systems and making them, which ones are literally a party because we live in a utopia where we have passed the new Green Deal and like it exists now, and then what is it to go to something where you are getting the catharsis of experiencing the aftermath of a disaster and hearing people's individual stories, and what does that do for you in the aftermath? So I don't know. I think it's a question I think about all the time, particularly in theater, and how to get people to the theater. But I think, I don't know, the psychedelic trip of it all, I do love that about theater. So, anybody else?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's looking at climate that way is a cultural thing, I think, to look as climate as just kind of science or school and boring. I mean, one thought is, imagine our world without our non-human kin, without any animals, without plants, just us here. That sounds pretty boring to me, right? It sounds kind of awful. So we're a part of the climate, so the climate's a part of us. So it should all be one big party, right? And I think kind of going back to the show that we did, the play that we did a month ago, in terms of everyone swimming, by having everyone kind of do a facsimile stroke of our non-human kin, kind of to paraphrase Muskrat, he pushes the envelope to save his community. In the end, he kind of sacrifices his life to do that, but it's that devotion to one's community and to one's kin that enabled, according to the story, for this land to be here. And so it should be fun. It should be engaging. I think engaging is probably one of the best ways, because we are engaged with the climate. And then it all should be inspirational as well.
Well, on that note, I mean, people don't often think of a panel as a party, but if a party is engaging and inspirational, then this was a bit of a party panel to kick off the summit. And I want to ask you, please, for a round of applause for this really distinguished panel. Thank you. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Amy.
Hi there, everyone. So panelists can stay in your seat. We're just going to welcome up 2 actors who are going to perform a scene from Walden for us, or do a reading. So a little bit about Walden. After returning from a year-long mission, moon mission, Cassie, a NASA botanist, finds herself in a remote cabin in the woods, where her estranged twin sister Stella, a former NASA architect, has found a new life with climate activist Brian. Old wounds resurface as the sisters attempt to pick up the pieces of the rivalry that broke them apart. Before the scene, Cassie arrived at Stella's house and met Stella's partner, Brian, for the first time. The role of Cassie will be read by Emily Shane, and the role of Brian will be read by Yonatan Gebeyu. All right, please welcome them up.